All right, I've got my DOS game, Master of Orion, in all its gloriousness. I've got DOSBox, the DOS emulator. Let's run it. First thing, I've got to mount disk drive C as the location of the game. Then I've got to switch to disk drive C, and then DOS game glory. Ah, yes. Well, in this video, I want to show you some ins and outs of using DOSBox to run your retro DOS games. And if you've ever looked at any of my talking head intros, in the upper left on my bookcase, you will see my original box for Master of Orion 1, a game that I still play and run on modern operating systems using DOSBox, and it runs perfectly. In fact, Moo would be the game I'd have with me if I could only have one game and I was stranded on a desert island. So let's look at how we use DOSBox to do this. Well, first of all, you got to get DOSBox. It's real simple. Just jump out to DosBox.com and go to Downloads. It's an installer, and install it on your machine. Here I am on DosBox.com. I'll go to Downloads, and I will pick my favorite download, whether I want for Mac OS X or Windows 32-bit or different flavors of Linux. Now, in this tutorial, I will be showing you DOSBox for Windows. So once you've downloaded it and installed it, you can either run it from the Start menu or from the desktop icon, and you're going to get this rather unfriendly looking command line window, which is DOS. Now, if I want to run a game in DOSBox, I have to issue a couple commands to make this happen. I have to mount a folder on my hard drive as disk drive C of the DOSBox emulator. And typically we're going to mount the folder of the game. Then we're going to change to disk drive C just like we would do with MS-DOS. And then we're going to type in the name of the game to run the game. So let's look at this. Now, a couple caveats. If you're typing a path that has space bars in it, you must put the path in double quotes. That's just a DOS thing. And if you're doing this on the Linux operating system and pointing it at a folder on your Linux machine, it is case sensitive, not so in DOS. So let me jump out and show you this. All right, so I'll just double click on the DOSBox shortcut. Here is DOSBox. The first thing I have to do is mount what is going to be disk drive C to the folder on my hard drive that has the game, which in this case is d:\Master of Orion \Orion. Now this could be anywhere on my hard drive, it doesn't matter, but I have to tell DOSBox where the mount point is for disk drive C, the fake disk drive C. Now you can see it's mounted the drive. It gave me positive feedback. Now, just like you would do in MS-DOS, I'd say C: to change to that folder. And if I go dir, these are the files of Master of Orion. And I happen to know that Orion is the name of the game I want to run Master of Orion. And it's launching the game. Now, when it does this, a couple of annoying things will happen. First of all, my mouse is captured inside of the window. Second of all, it is running it as a window. So there are some keyboard commands we can use that will let us overcome this. So just running the game in its default mode, it's running windowed at its original resolution, which gives you a very small window. And you can't move the mouse outside of the window. So how do we overcome that? And that's worth learning some keyboard shortcuts. So Control F10 will release the mouse from the DOSBox window so you can go back to Windows and operate normally. Now, on most people's computers today and laptops, you have to push in the Fn key to make the function keys F1 through F12 across the top actually operate as function keys. So instead of Control F10, I've got to go Control Fn F10, and that will release my mouse. The other thing that you want to know is how do I get to full screen? And that is Alt Enter. So if you do Alt Enter, it'll go to full screen. You do Alt Enter again, it will come back from full screen. But you know, sometimes I'd like to run it somewhere in between full screen and little teeny tiny original resolution. So we're going to look at that. Now, other issues you may run into is depending on how much CPU the game needs, you may need to use Control F11 or Control F12 to let the DOSBox emulator have more cycles to speed up emulation or to slow down emulation. Now there is a bunch more keys at the wiki, www.DosBox.com/wiki/special keys, and you can check all of that out there. Alright, so if I click in the window, you can clearly see my mouse is captured and I cannot move outside of the window. So Control, Function, F10, I've now released my mouse and I can move the window around. I can do things like bring up Task Manager and see how much CPU this sucker is using. And it is using very little CPU, so I think I'm in good shape. So let's move on to how we can make it run this application full screen, or better yet, as a custom sized window. Let's look at what that takes to make happen. So to run my DOS game in a custom window, set the window size I want so I'm not running full screen, I got to do two things. I've got to create a shortcut to the game, and I'm going to do that by making a copy of the DOSBox shortcut. And then I'm going to customize its target and start locations, its start-in locations. Then I have to put a copy of the DOSBox configuration file somewhere where I can point the shortcut at it, so it will use that configuration. And then I'm going to have to edit that configuration file, whatever I call it. So let's jump in and look at those steps. So here is my DOSBox shortcut. I'm just going to right click and drag on it and say copy here, and I'm going to rename it Master of Orion dash windowed. Now that I've got that done, let's get this in position. There we go. That's good. I'm going to right click and go to properties, and the two things I'm going to need to change here are the target, and I'm going to have to change the start-in location. So the start-in location needs to point at the folder the game is in, and that's going to be D:\\Master of Orion \Orion. That is my game location. Now yours might be disk drive C or whatever. And then up here in the target, we don't need to change the first part, but the last part is we need to tell it to use a configuration file. So that's going to be -conf, and then the name of the configuration file I'm going to put in the game folder, which is going to be DosBox.conf. So this is the name of the file we need to make sure we put into the game folder. And I'm just going to double check here, and everything looks good. Now the second part is we've got to put a configuration file in the game folder, and the easiest way to do that is to edit the main DOSBox configuration file from the start menu and then save it into the game folder. So let me show you that. So I'm going to go get the DOSBox configuration file. If I go down to D for DOSBox, open up that folder on my start menu, and I go down to DOSBox options, that will open the configuration file, and then I can do a save as into the game folder as the name I want. All right, so here is the DOSBox configuration file I saved in the game folder. And, you know, if you want to run the game in full screen, you only need to make one change. You need to change full screen equals false to full screen equals true. Now, anytime I edit a configuration file like this, I leave the original line alone by putting a hashtag in it that comments it out. The pound sign means this is a comment, not a command, and then I could make this change, file menu, save, and I'm done. But I don't want to do it this way. I want to run Master of Orion in an arbitrary size window. So I'm going to leave this as false and get rid of the second line and put it back originally how it was. Now, to make it easier for you to see the changes I'm making in this file, I've opened it in WordPad because WordPad will let me select a line of text and change the text color. Don't use WordPad to edit your DOSBox configuration file because you need to save the file as a text file. But let's take a look at the changes I made to run Master of Orion in a window. Well, the first change I made was I said full resolution equals, and I told it 1440 by 900. Now, by experimentation, I figured out this was a good resolution to run Master of Orion on my computer. Now, you can see I commented out the original command it had, which was full resolution equals original, and that's why it runs in that little teeny tiny window. I want it to run much larger. The second thing I changed was window resolution equals 1440 by 900. Now I found you set both of these to the same value. I'm be honest with you, I cannot tell you exactly the difference between these two, but set them the same. Now here's the key line. Output equals D draw. That is direct draw. If you leave it as output equals overlay or output equals one of the other options, here are the different options we can use for output. Surface, overlay, OpenGL, which you'll want to be using if you're on a Mac or Linux, or direct draw. These are the two that seem to work the best. Direct draw is best for Windows because that's going to let it dynamically size the window. And then I went ahead and changed one other feature, auto lock equals false from auto lock equals true. Now it no longer captures the mouse, and as soon as I move the mouse off the edge of the Master of Orion window, it just turns back into the Windows mouse, and I don't have to do that special function key to release the mouse. Yeah, I had to go look for a second. It's Control F10. I don't want to have to memorize keystrokes to play the game. So I set auto lock equals to false. One more setting I needed to change down here is I changed the scalar from HQ2x to scalar HQ3x. And that just seems to make it look better when it enlarges the window. You can play around with this, but those are the settings I changed. Now the last thing you got to do in DOSBox config is those commands we had to type at the command line, which were to create the mount point for the fake disk drive C for DOSBox. So in this case, we can say mount disk drive C as dot that means current folder. Because remember, we said with the shortcut, we said run it in this folder. Then we switch to disk drive C. Now here they're doing a clear screen just to make the DOSBox opening message go away. We're running the game, and then this exit right here makes it close the DOSBox window once you've exited the game. So whatever the name of your game is what you need to put here. So these are the changes I had to make in DOSBox config to run Master of Orion. So let's see if it works. Let me make the changes in the other file. I'll do that off screen. I've showed them to you here, and then we'll try to run our game with the shortcut. Alright, so I've made my changes to the DOSBox config, full resolution, output equals direct draw, window resolution, auto lock false, etc., etc. I've added the DOS commands at the bottom here to mount disk drive C in the current folder and run Orion. Everything looks good. I'm going to close this. I'll tell you what, I'll just minimize it. So now my shortcut is pointing at that folder and tells DOSBox when it runs to use the configuration file I just created. So drum roll. Oh, look at that. It's bumping up to size. It's loading the game. The excitement builds. And I'll just click to the opening screen. So there it is. It's running. Now I could load a game, or I could continue a game, or whatever I want to do. But I'll quit to DOS, and you'll see that it closes the game window. So, you know, new game, medium galaxy, impossible, 5 opponents. And yeah, I'll be human. That sounds good. Pick the color I want to be. Let's be red. And of course. And it's creating the galaxy, and I can start the game. Isn't that wonderful? It's working perfectly. And I can minimize it, go back to do something else. I can bring my DOSBox back. I can run the game normally, save my game. Do all my wonderful stuff, and life is happy. So one last thing. If you remember one of your favorite old games and you want to be able to run them, one way to get them is to go to GOG.com, Good Old Games, and for the old DOS games, they actually use DOSBox to run them, and they give you custom shortcuts and custom configuration files to run each game. So it's possible to just make a copy of that shortcut and make a copy of the configuration file as I've showed you and change those settings so you do not run the good old game version of your DOS game in full screen. I'll show you that. Let's take a look at the Good Old Games website. So for instance, here is Master of Orion 1 and 2 for $5.99 if you buy it and download it. Another advantage of buying it through them is they have disabled the copy protection. Master of Orion would at some point in the game pop up a picture and show you a ship image, and you had to pick the name of the ship. You had to match it correctly, and that has been disabled in this version of the game, so that definitely gets rid of one little nuisance when you're trying to use your original copy of your DOS game to run the game. So let me show you how Good Old Games sets this up and what we can do to run the Good Old Games version in a window instead of full screen. So when you buy the DOS game through Good Old Games and install it, it's going to put a shortcut on your desktop. And if I right click on this shortcut and go to Properties, you can see it's running its own version of DOSBox that comes with the install, and it is running a custom configuration file just like we did, -conf DOSBox mu1.conf, It does not open a console window. They added another command line, and then they added a final command that says exit when you're done. And this is the folder it's running out of, which is on disk drive C under Program Files, Master of Orion, Good Old Games. Here we go, Good Old Games, Master of Orion 1, and this is where the configuration file is that we need to edit. Well, the first thing we do is we create a copy of the shortcut, and I have already done that to run it in a window. And if you look right here at Properties, the only change I've made in the shortcut is I am pointing it at a different configuration file. So let's go to the folder of the game, and I can't quite get there by saying open file location because they're running it in a different folder, but let's open it up here and get to the right location for the configuration file. So here is where it's doing DOSBox. If I go up another level, let's see exactly where it is. It is in Program Files x86, Good Old Games, Master of Orion 1 and 2, and if I go into Master of Orion 1, this is the original configuration file, and I copied it into this file and made the changes to run it in a window. So if I just right-click Edit, you'll see that I made full screen false, I set my full resolution, I set my window resolution, I set my output to direct draw, I told it not to capture the mouse, and I also told it to use the scalar HQ3X, and these commands at the end were already in there. We can compare them. If I look at the original configuration file, you can see it's running full screen equals true and doesn't have these settings set, but it does have the commands to run the game at the end. So that's another thing you can do that is somewhat simpler. You make a copy of the shortcut it creates at GOG, and then make a copy of the configuration file, and then edit that copy. So now I can run it full screen, or I can run it non-full screen. And that's going to wrap up a quick tutorial on DOSBox and running DOS games. Don't give up your old favorite games. Keep playing them with DOSBox. Take care. And oh, by the way, sometimes people ask you to do that thing at end of videos where you click on that thingy so that you get other thingies from me. If you want to do that, I would appreciate it. Take care.